Cafe, the book lovers rendezvous. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of RBC with my co-host Linn, Ridge Books, Calhoun, Georgia.
Good morning, Ed and Brian. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Well,
And
thank you, Lee.
hello to Brian Shellum. He is an author, a historian. He's a classmate. We both have the same alumni. And we're recording this on February Eve. It's our first show of Black History Month. Glad to have you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Ed, and Lee. Thanks for the invitation.
And Brian, I asked you to come on board because I've read a couple of your books, and because your topic is so pertinent to what's coming up this month, Black History. But before we get into that, I want to say, I see a library behind you. Lee, I don't know about you, but some of my best acquisitions have been libraries from historians, whether they were academicians, or just freelancers.
We know what you mean.
Brian, you must have some good material back there.
Yeah, I've got a lot of books. As a matter of fact, when I was introduced to my wife, one of my very good friends warned her that I had a lot of books. So she ignored that warning, but she is putting some pressure on me to pare down my book collection. So we occasionally have to do that.
It doesn't work. We thought 20 years ago we could pare down our book collection by selling some. It only increases the number of books that you have.
Yeah.
If you decide to sell them, give me a call. I'll take them on consignment. Get you the most for your money.
All right. Did you move? You moved your store?
Yes, I'm now in New Haven, Lee. I'm back from Hawaii. I think I'm going to be settling into New Haven and resurrecting a new book career. More to come on that. Brian, on your CV and on your social profile sites, you identify yourself as a historian. And what does that mean?
Well, for me, it means that I research and I write history from original sources, preferably, and I found some years ago an area that I became very interested in and passionate about, Buffalo Soldiers, the history of Buffalo Soldiers, and for me, I was fortunate because it was kind of fertile ground to research and write about at the time. It still is, and so I stumbled on a very interesting character who got me into the Buffalo Soldiers, and I started writing about him. I was fortunate to find a publisher, the University of Nebraska Press, and they were good enough to publish my first book. And then once I got established and they saw that the things that I researched and write about were sought after, I didn't have much trouble getting books published by the University of Nebraska Press after that. So I'm fortunate with that.
I think most of us are familiar with or have some familiarity with the term Buffalo Soldiers. We've heard it, the movies, the books, but we may not be able to string together a definition of just exactly what that means. But you could probably do that for us.
Yeah, well, there's a bit of controversy about the term Buffalo Soldier. It's a term that really came into common currency in the 20th century, really, and of course with Bob Marley, his famous song. It's used a lot today, but in the time that the Buffalo Soldiers were making their name, they would have been called Negro regiments or Black regulars. In the time they were serving, very few people called them Buffalo Soldiers. There's a reference in
but maybe the
White
Indians.
Officer's. Yeah, there's a reference in a White Officer's memoir. It was coined in the 1860s, 1870s by the Comanche and the Cheyenne, I think. Initially, I found references to it doing research about the Ute Indians in Utah in the 1880s. They called them Buffalo Soldiers because of the color of their skin and the curliness of their hair to them resembled the buffalo, and so that was their term. It could have also been used by the Comanche and the Cheyenne, especially because their first fight with them was a pretty nasty fight, and they respected they respected their fighting ability. But there's no that's where the agreement ends. After that, if there are some people who want to create some kind of an empathetic connection between the blacks and Indians, and I've never seen any evidence of that. To the Native Americans, the black soldiers were just blue-clad soldiers trying to take away their way of life. So there was no
black
connection.
soldiers. And the black soldiers, the Indians, were the enemies of the country, and they had a responsibility to act upon orders respectively.
That's right. Yeah, and yeah. So the Buffalo Soldiers, the black regiments, were following orders, and they basically did what they were told to do, and they were led by white officers almost exclusively.
Now, you said earlier that one of the responsibilities of the historian is to take information, preferably first-person information. And being a book collector, I love handling that material. What are some of the material that the first person, or have you met any descendants of Buffalo Soldiers, and where has this research taken you geographically?
Well, first and foremost, you go into the official War Department records, enlistment records. A great source if you're trying to tell the story of a particular guy in a particular regiment are the regimental returns. So every month, a regiment wrote a 4-page report of how many people they had, what their actions were, who was lost, who was assigned, and things, and special events that happened during that month. And so that's a real good source. Register the soldiers enlisted, and there's a very good document, the register of enlistments that show where he was born, how many times he signed up, and then you're very fortunate if you ever find a black enlisted soldier in the 1800s and even the early 1900s who wrote anything down, and even if he did, whether that was saved by the family, letters, for instance, which is a great source of information on officers, but less so for the enlisted soldiers. I was fortunate in my latest book that I was able to find that one of it's about Charles Young, and he was a captain and a troop commander, and he had a soldier who was his company clerk, and he was educated and he wrote, and he exchanged letters with Young's widow years later when they were trying to put together information for a biography. And he wrote well, he had a very good memory, and so I was really fortunate to have those firsthand. I mean, he went on for 14 pages in one letter, and that
where are those
something
letters
like
housed
that
today?
is priceless. Yeah.
Where are those letters housed today?
They are in the Charles Young Buffaloes. They're housed in. Charles Young, who I've written extensively about, was a pack rat, and he kept everything, and so he kept all these letters, and then his wife also kept that stuff. I happened to discover this cache of letters, pictures, and documents right around 2001 when I was researching my first book, and the people had them up in their attic, and they were. I worried every night about those, that they were going to burn up in a house fire. So I finally convinced them to donate them to an archive. So they're housed, the best Charles Young collection, Buffalo Soldier collection, is at the National Afro-American Museum Cultural Center in Wilberforce, Ohio, which is was formerly on the grounds of Wilberforce University, and it's where Young later went to teach military tactics, and that was his home. So it's all right there.
Well, it's on my to-visit list now.
And he was from Ohio. I mean, he was nominated.
Yeah, he was. My initial research was on Charles Young and his claim to fame. He was the third Black graduate of West Point. He graduated in 1889. And then he was the third Black graduate, but he was the first West Point Black graduate that had a successful military career. The two before him, one died early, John Hanks Alexander, and then Henry O'Flipper, who everybody's familiar with, graduated in 1877. He joined the 10th U.S. Cavalry, one of the Buffalo Soldier Cavalry regiments, and as a lieutenant, he was court-martialed and kicked out of the Army on what most people agree were trumped-up charges. So Young really carried the banner for. He was the only Black officer after Alexander died in 1894 until Benjamin O. Davis came along in 1901. So for nearly 20 years, so he went on to a lot of other firsts. First Black military attaché, first Black National Park superintendent. I can talk about that later. A bunch of other things, and he was just a pretty amazing man.
I think this is a good spot, Brian, for you to flash your books up and share with our audience exactly the curricula vitae of what we're talking about here.
Okay. So my first book, since I was a new author, and I'm not even sure I could get a book published. It was called Black Cadet in a White Bastion. It's about Charles Young at West Point. So it covers his early life. He was born enslaved in Kentucky. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. His parents escaped enslavement when he was 6 months old, fled north to Ohio, where he was raised. His father joined the Union Army. He was raised in a small town, Ripley, Ohio, went to West Point. And so my first book's really about his early life and then his struggles at West Point. He graduated in 1889. So that's my first book. It's a fairly slim book, but it was a good book to take on if you're a first-time author. I started out just wanting to do a bio, but on Young, but I soon realized it was just too big a bite for the first book. So
good for you.
In my second book, I wrote about his military career. So this is Black Officer in a Buffalo Soldier Regiment. I published this one in 2010. The first book was 2006. This was in 2010. And it's about his military career.
Earlier you said, Brian, that some of the officers were white. Were they integrated officer units, or was it company commander and above were white? What was the segregation of the races at that time, at that level of officership?
Well, so when they set up the Buffalo Soldier regiments after the Civil War, about 50% of the soldiers that went into the Buffalo Soldier regiments were had served in the Black volunteer regiments during the Civil War. But the Congress set up the rules, probably on purpose, that said the portion of former Civil War volunteer officers who were allowed in had to have at least 2 years of service. And there were plenty of Black officers that served with the Black volunteer regiments, but none had served more than 2 years just because of when they came into service. And so they were all white officers initially, a mix of West Pointers and volunteer officers who got regular Army commissions from their Civil War service. So yeah, they were exclusively white officers and all black enlisted men in the Buffalo Soldier regiments until the graduation of Henry O. Flipper in 1877. And then John Hanks Alexander in 1886, and then Charles Young in 1889. And then those were the only three officers that graduated in the 19th century from West Point. The door closed to black officers after Young graduated in 1889, Jim Crow, and there was not another black officer graduated from West Point until almost 50 years later, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. in 1936.
So did all three of them command black regiments then?
No, well, they were initially, when you go out into a regiment, you're a second lieutenant, so you're at the lowest rung as an Army officer, and you command in those days there were three officers in a troop, in a cavalry troop or an infantry company. So you had a captain who commanded the troop, and then he was assisted by a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant. And so they served as lieutenants, and they commanded black enlisted men. And so the first two, Flipper and Alexander, never rose above the rank of lieutenant just because of the limited time they were in there. But Young continued to rise in rank. And so that became an increasing problem for the Army, not for Young, because he was a competent officer. As he rose in rank and became a captain, then he commanded a troop which had two white officers in it. And then when he became a major, he commanded four cavalry troops with a whole bunch of white officers. And so that became an increasing problem for the War Department as Young rose in rank to major, lieutenant colonel, and then finally colonel. So I'll talk about that.
A great figure to highlight on Black History Month. Wow,
Yeah. And so I'll finish with my books. This is African American officers in Liberia, a pestiferous rotation, 1910 to 1942. I'm
Not
told
everybody
my
uses the word
editor,
pestiferous in a title.
she knows of out there that has pestiferous in the title. I'm quite proud of that. But this in many ways was the hardest book I had to write, just because I had to learn so much about African history and also American political history. It talks about Charles Young and 16 other African American officers who served in that period, 1910 to 1942, in Liberia, and they were sent there on a mission to retrain, equip, and actually lead the Liberian frontier forces to allow them to keep the colonial powers at bay, because the colonial powers were trying to take over chunks of Liberia, which initially was established by the United States for enslaved people from the United States. And so their mission, it's a mission that the Army does all the time here. We call it train and equip. These guys, as far as I know, if there's any historian out there who can prove me wrong, this was the first U.S. Army train and equip and lead. I mean, the African American officers led forces in combat against tribal revolts and maintain border security. So that's that story. And then the last book I published, this just came out in 2021, is Buffalo Soldiers in Alaska. It's about Company L, 24th Infantry. Also a fascinating untold story. It's about a company of black infantrymen who were stationed in Skagway, Alaska, from 1899 to 1902 at the tail end of the Klondike Gold Rush. There was lawlessness, and it's if you've ever watched the series Deadwood, it's like Deadwood taking place in Alaska. Another fascinating story. They were also trying to keep the British honest up there, because remember, we had recently purchased Alaska from Russia, and the British, who still controlled Canadian foreign policy, had troops stationed there, and they thought the border should be, down here, and that they should own Skagway. We thought the border should be 12 miles inland, and that we should have Skagway. And then, of course, gold was discovered, and then it became a really important issue. So the troops were there to keep the British troops from coming across the border. So another fascinating story. My last, my current book, I can show a picture of the cover. That's what it looks like. Is Buffalo Soldiers in California. It comes out probably in June or July of this year. And it's about Charles Young and the 9th Cavalry in the period 1902 to 1904, when they were stationed in San Francisco, Presidio, San Francisco. The regiment the 9th had just returned from a pretty nasty guerrilla war in the Philippines, in the Philippine-American War. They'd done very good. They had performed well and were rewarded with plum assignments on the West Coast, Fort Walla Walla, Washington, Presidio of Monterey in California, and the Presidio of San Francisco in California. And so it's about the squadron that was about the two in California, and they had a really interesting mission, and that was they were sent out every summer to patrol and protect our national parks. So they were dispatched to Yosemite, to Sequoia National Park, and they were park rangers for the summer. They built roads. If you've ever driven that windy road into Sequoia National Park, white engineers who worked under Captain Charles Young and his soldiers built that road into the park.
And then another tidbit is, because I've hiked it, is they built the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney.
Yeah, they did. And I've made several trips out to Sequoia National Park, and talked to the historians there, and they still can't figure out. They blazed a trail between their camp in the giant forest in Sequoia National Park across to the top of Mount Whitney, where they were stationed, and they've still never figured out the trail. They can't make that passage, and somehow 100 years ago they did that. So yeah, pretty amazing. Another great untold story. So.
And where's your book sold, Brian? Where can people pick it up?
You can get them on Amazon mainly. You'll find them occasionally in a bookstore,
Yeah,
but on Amazon.
I felt like I needed to read something. That's my exposure to a book about the Buffalo Soldiers was John Preble's novel about them fighting the Comanches. And you're not on Kindle. So I had to wait for Amazon. It came yesterday afternoon. So I managed to read, well, I've got Young to his second year after his second year as a plebe.
Okay.
That's how far I got last night.
Okay. All right.
Author,
They should be available on Kindle. I've got Kindle copies of my first two books, just in case I need to refer to them when I'm on the road.
I could not find it on Kindle.
Okay.
So I don't know. One thing that I found interesting about it is that that you were very honest in saying we can't find records of this, or we can't find any written, evidence of this.
Yeah. And some of the reviewers have been a little critical because they state that I don't have all of the records. Well, as far as I know, the records just don't exist. I'm sure I can find additional ones here 20 years later. Things pop up all the time. I'm finding things, but but really that's most the story that can be told about that period in his life. It's pretty much there. I could probably add a few paragraphs to it, but that particular book is kind of, I think, stood the test of time, as has my second book. It's still a reference book. Every once in a while I have to go these days, because of electronic publishing, and how they print books these days. If I find a mistake in my second book, I tell my editor, and she goes in, and the next copy, the next run, they have it corrected. It's just
Well, we love having authors on the show, because if otherwise we wouldn't have books, and otherwise we wouldn't have anything to talk about.
right, yeah. And I'll be long dead before they're in antique bookstores, I guess.
I've got one more question for you, and I'm sure Lee does before we sign off. Now, you said that the responsibility of a historian is to research and record information. Is there any responsibility for a historian to interpret it in the context of the times, or in context of contemporary society, and to put your opinion into what you register?
I don't think there is. So here's the line I draw. I'm responsible to write history, find original sources, write history, avoid secondary sources, and unless there's absolutely no way you can find, or sometimes I use secondary sources to quote an original source that he puts in there, just because I can't find the original narrative or the original document. For instance, I in the book I'm writing right now, I cite an interview that Dr. Kaufman did with a Buffalo Soldier, and I can't find the original interview, but I trust Kaufman, and so I use that. But yeah, I believe it's a historian's duty to write the facts, present all the facts you can find, make it interesting, so people will read it, and then I draw the line. I do analysis, so I don't mind stating a fact and then giving it a little analysis, saying, in the context of the times, or compared to other things, their analysis, you cite census figures, and then you cite the percentages of before and after. It gives some analysis, so you can tell you can tell the audience what the trend is, or what that might mean. But I don't believe a historian should interpret anything. I draw the line there. I just present the facts, do analysis, and I let the reader draw his own conclusions and make his own interpretations.
Lee, let's take one last question out from you.
Well, oh gosh, let me think. So as a reader, I can interpret that based on the little that I have read last night. I can interpret that the Southern cadets at West Point were more likely to be negative toward Young, and more likely to be to give him a hard time because of their experience during the Civil War. But all you say is it's mostly from the Southern cadets. And
yeah,
but
perhaps
if I want to make that conclusion, then
yeah, so
I'm the one to make that conclusion.
Yeah, maybe my analysis wasn't as developed enough almost 20 years ago when I was writing this. I guess what I was trying to say is when I lined up all of the cadets who were that he considered in a letter that I quote in there 20 years later, he considered them as cadets that showed him kindness.
Right.
They were pretty much all from the north,
right,
northeast.
right.
And just from my reading and you know, the people that were not very kind to him tended to be from southern states. Of course, and I know that from my general reading about the time. And it makes sense. Southerners.
It made sense to me,
Yeah.
and I didn't find it difficult to make that, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's that's
Yeah,
where interpretation comes in.
right.
You have your own background and you interpret that the way that it should. That's just the conclusion I came to. But I didn't have very much information to work with because I don't have any quotes of racial slurs, and I couldn't tell if they were from Southern cadets or all I could tell was the people who Young considered his friends and who were showed him friendship is what the term he uses in that letter, were all from the North and the North East states, and those states had a tradition of being more liberal in racial attitudes at the time.
Wow, Brian, we could just keep on going. There's so many other questions I want to ask you. I think we're going to have you back when your new book comes out, because
Okay.
we haven't even talked about the Buffalo Soldiers at West Point.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I'm doing right now. You know, I just have a couple of housekeeping things, an index to write for my book on California, and now I'm doing the research and writing for Buffalo Soldiers at West Point. They served there as equestrian instructors. They taught cadets horsemanship from 1907 to 1947. And again, it's another fascinating untold story, and I'm into that right now. It's just going to be another neat story.
I
Well,
do
if
have
there's
another
anybody
question. Oh,
go ahead, Lee.
The term Buffalo Soldiers has continued to be used, even though it predated, like, you know, Young's involvement with West Point and all of that. Is it just kind of one of those cultural things that the name stuck?
Yeah, I think it's I think so when I go and there's Buffalo Soldiers associations all over the country, you know, and they ride horses and they try to teach inner city kids good values and horsemanship, and there's Buffalo Soldier motorcycle gangs, not gangs, motorcycle clubs that also do good things, they consider Buffalo Soldier a term that has a proud history, and so if they associate that with him, and the original intent was a positive one by the Comanche and the Cheyenne, why not use it? I can tell you, here's a story about titles. An author has to be very careful how he comes up with a title, because if you notice that all of my books but one have Buffalo Soldier in the title. And so when somebody goes to a bookstore, they see something with Buffalo Soldier, they'll grab it and they'll look at it. My one book that I let somebody talk me into leaving Buffalo Soldiers out of it, African American Officers in Liberia, is my least sold book of all, and I think it's because Buffalo Soldiers is not in the title. If I had called it Buffalo,
I think it's the least sold book because pestiferous is in the title.
Oh, I think that would make me buy it.
All right, to all our listeners out there, if there's anybody we're going to celebrate in the month of February, traditionally Black History Month, our American Buffalo Soldiers. You want to thank a vet, thank a Buffalo Soldiers. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Lynn.
And we'll see you next show, everybody. Rare Book Cafe. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify, and wherever good podcasts are given away for free. Bye-bye.
And remember that we are sponsored through the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair.
And Biblio.com.
That's right.
Got it in this time.
We did.
We're always looking for a sponsor. Starbucks, we're drinking your coffee. Where are you out there?